The Cause and the Cure by Mark Devlin. 1990, Oxford, England, and the respectable facade of the City of Dreaming Spires is being shattered by a series of brutal murders. Radio reporter Verity Hunter has noticed that a particular breed of retribution is at play, and she stumbles upon another aspect of Oxford hidden from view, the world of elite secret societies. A crime thriller set during a time of great cultural change gets taken to uncharted territories through allegory and metaphor, and the narrative's interplay with spiritual teachings. The Cause and the Cure is available now via Amazon or direct from the author. Just email markdevlinuk@gmail.com to arrange.
Good vibrations.
And welcome back to another episode of Good Vibrations. This is episode number 150. I am your guest host today, Ivan from Phoenix. And today's episode is a special show where once again I return to turn the tables on Mark Devlin, where I will be interviewing Mark on the release of his new book, The Cause and the Cure. So, had the privilege of reading and or listening to Mark's new book, and I have to say I was pleasantly surprised at the detail, the length, because converting it to an audio file on my own, it gave me about a 7-hour book. And as anyone who's listened to my stuff knows, usually I listen to things at work, and that makes the time go by faster, and it's an easier way of absorbing information. All that having been said, let me introduce Mark to his show, which is my show for today. Mark Devlin, welcome to Good Vibrations.
Well, Ivan, thanks for having me back on my show. It's always good to be on. And this is a biannual tradition now, isn't it? We've done this 2016, 2018 and 2020. I guess I'll just have to keep the books coming.
Yes, you will. And what are we? About 10 days into the new year. So did you plan this? Because I remember we were going to do this about a month ago, and you pushed it back due to circumstances to, the beginning of this year. So maybe it was in the cards to do this every even year, huh? 16, 18, and 20.
Well, it seems the universe has seen to it that way. I had planned to do it in December, just prior to Christmas, but I found myself with a real bottleneck of work. It was all starting to mount up. And quite apart from anything else, I'm getting ready to move home, actually, in the early part of this year. So anyone that's ever done that will understand how stressful it is. And at the moment, I'm packing boxes ready for that. So I've got a hell of a lot of stuff going on. So I wanted to take care of this show before I get too far into all that madness. And I had actually intended to get this novel published in the early part of 2020, but I found I was steaming ahead with the writing at such a rapid pace last year that it was realistic to get it out just before Christmas. So I was able to get it published at the end of November. I think the first copies came out. So it's a 2019 book, but here we are in 2020 talking about it.
Okay. And you touched on kind of one of the questions I was going to bring up here regarding the book. You were moving along, chugging along, like you said, steamrolling on there, and it shows in the book. That's maybe one of the first areas I want to start is the detail. Because I would think just your average kind of person attempting to write a book would just write basic things, just going off the top of my head, just he walked into the house, she said hello, blah, 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 very, very basic. Yeah. This book is far from that. Right from the beginning, in the first, couple of pages, I just noticed such an attention to detail. I mean, you were describing things, person walks into a house, what the house looks like, what the things are in there, what it smells like, what the person's wearing. I'm like, this is almost like a Stephen King kind of book or something. So where did that come about that you were able to put so much detail? Was that something intentional, or is that just instinctually just came out from you? Were you possessed? Was this something from somewhere else?
Well, I do wonder, because it's like that with a lot of public talks that I do. I find myself putting information out and certain words and phrases, and afterwards I can watch a video back of the presentation and think, where the hell did that come from? And it was a bit like that right in the book. The words were just flowing through me, so it seems like it was a story that was in the ether waiting to be told, and I became the outlet and the conduit for it. So I'd never written fiction before. This is my first stab at it. One of the things that inspired me to do it was the book The Memoirs of Billy Shears by Thomas Hugh Harriott. There are 2 volumes of that, and anyone that's looked into the Paul McCartney situation will be very familiar with those books, no doubt, and has listened to previous shows. So that purports to be the memoirs of the individual who is said to have taken on the public role of Paul McCartney and taken over from the original guy. I know everyone's got an opinion on this, and people will make of the whole subject matter what they will, but the thing about that book is it was presented to the general public as a work of historical fiction, and thus it came with plausible deniability attached. So it was dropping many truth bombs, in my opinion. There is a lot of truth in that book, but it's laden and padded with a lot of fictional embellishments as well. And so if anyone ever questioned the author or the encoder, Thomas Hugh Harriott, or if anyone ever attempted to haul his arse into court in some kind of legal case, what he's got to fall back on is the fact that he's told everyone that it's a work of fiction. And he can just say, come on, you didn't take that seriously, did you? This piece of information that you think I'm being sincere about is obviously just a fictional embellishment. So I thought, well, there is a lot that you can get away with by dressing it up as fiction. So you can make statements, you can put truthful information out there, you can come with stuff that is really going to resonate with people and is really going to be potent, and they're really going to remember, it's going to stay with them, and they're going to be drawing on the fact that they heard this stuff for potentially years ahead. And yet, if you put it out under the guise of fiction, you can always point to that if ever you're challenged on any of these points. And another thing that inspired it is how pissed off and tired I am of posting something online, whether it's a Facebook post or whether it's putting up a YouTube video. And the minute you put it there, you get a torrent, an avalanche, a tsunami of opinions. So I put something up on Facebook today, and I said there are 3 things you can always be sure of in life. Normally we're told it's 2, death and taxes. But actually it's 3, death, taxes and opinions. Because everyone's got a goddamn opinion. And then people try to pull you up on stuff and say, that's wrong, you got this piece of data wrong, and don't you realise it's that, and that's not the way to look at this situation, this is the correct way. And I thought, another way of resolving all of that and shutting all that noise down is by putting out a book as a work of fiction. So then you can say, well, it's just a story, man, come on, don't get all twisted out of shape, it's just a story. So those are the things that inspired me to have a crack at a work of fiction. You've read it, mate, or listened to it, and anyone that has will be aware that there are elements of my previous work which come through in this narrative. Anyone that's read Musical Truth Volumes 1 and 2 will recognise certain scenarios which I've woven into the narrative. And there's a lot of my own personality that comes through, I think, including my very sarcastic, sardonic, dry sense of humour, which is the only thing that keeps me sane in this game sometimes. So all of that went into it, and it was a very enjoyable process. As I say, the book kind of wrote itself. I got it done much quicker than I'd expected. I started it in March, and I finished writing in, I think it was late October or mid-October. So it was a great experience, and now is the time to unleash it on the world and hope that people get out of it everything that I'd intended for it to be.
Great. Okay, so all that having been said, let's get into some of the aspects of the book that I noticed. I noticed 3 aspects. The whodunit part, then we have all the occulted knowledge that's scattered through it. That's another part for the awakened or the conscious people to pick up on. And third, the historical aspect of it, because this book takes place, it kind of resonated with me because it takes place from around March of 1990 through May of 1991. And in my personal life, there were certain things happening, and in the world also. So those are the three things I noticed right away that stood out, were the whodunit aspect, the truther, occulted knowledge aspect that's in there, and the historical part of it. So, let's take one of these, the whodunit aspect, and how did that come about?
Well, they say you should write about what you know. And one thing I know a lot about is the city of Oxford, England, because I was born there and I've always lived around it. I've never actually lived in Oxford, but I've always lived in the surrounds. And also, the story is set in 1990, as you say, for the most part. The bulk of the story takes place from March 1990 onwards. And then there's a section of it that takes place in March 1991, when everything kind of gets wrapped up. And then there's an epilogue set in 1996, right at the end, where you get to find out what happened to all of the characters long term. So I knew a lot about life in Oxford. I brushed up a bit on some of the historical aspects of the city. It's a very fascinating place to write about. I think you can get much more out of setting a story in Oxford than you can most cities in the UK, because Oxford is basically a breeding ground and a training ground for elite Illuminati, in inverted commas, establishment types through the university system that we've got here. So Oxford and Cambridge in the UK, for the benefit of American listeners, are like the equivalent of Harvard and Yale. It's the Ivy League elite academic institutions. So there's that aspect to Oxford. It's got a very long, rich, deep history. And there are aspects of that I've weaved into it. It's got occult aspects to it as well. By way of an example, the River Thames, which flows through Oxford, it comes up from London, or it comes up from its source actually through Oxford out towards London. And as it flows through Oxford, it changes its name. And it's always been known as the River Isis, straight out of Egyptian mythology. So that's quite interesting, isn't it? And then you've got the academic literary background of Oxford. So the writers C.S. Lewis, Lewis Carroll, and J.R.R. Tolkien all came out of Oxford and wrote their famous stories here, whether it was Alice in Wonderland or The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe or The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. All these works of fiction came out of Oxford. So it's a very interesting place to get into. And then the other thing about the story being set in 1990, I mean, we're just coming up to the 30th anniversary of that. So one of the reasons I wanted to get this book out in 2020 is to mark the 30th anniversary of all these events. And there are real-world events built into the narrative. So you'll have noticed that it references the First Gulf War, so-called, which was sparked initially in August of 1990, when Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq at the time, invaded neighbouring Kuwait, and George Bush Sr., who was US President at the time, and Margaret Thatcher, who was British Prime Minister, started banging the war drums and threatening him with military action if he didn't withdraw his troops. Of course, we know that the whole thing was about oil interests, primarily, as most of these wars of conquest in the Middle East are. But then in January 91, there was a full-scale military strike launched against Iraq, spearheaded by George Bush. By that point, Margaret Thatcher had been ousted from government by her own cabinet, who turned on her, Night of the Long Knives, and John Major had been installed as British Prime Minister. So that's another interesting event that happened during the story's time frame. And then you've got things like, the acid house and rave scene is actually a subplot that bubbles away under the surface. So, as you say, you've got the whodunit element, the crime thriller, which is what the book is ostensibly on its surface. But a subplot that you get throughout is documenting the acid house, rave, dance music scene that was in full flow in 1990. So 1988, which is something I've talked about in my Musical Truth Volume 2 book and in many of my talks and interviews, was known as the Second Summer of Love. And it was a big social engineering psyop, in my view, which was a reboot of what had been done in the 1960s with the counterculture psychedelic scene. What we had in 88 and going through 89, which is when all the big dance festivals happened in fields around the M25, around London, was a repackaging of that whole thing. And we had the arrival of ecstasy pills to replace the LSD that had been the drug of choice in that previous scene. And we had this new electronic dance music, which was the soundtrack to the whole thing. So you get aspects of that cropping up through the plot, and there's a couple of characters, Charlie and Molly, what's in a name, who figure very heavily in that, and we get to find out some stuff about them. So, yeah, the book is layered, and I mentioned on the blurb, on the back sleeve of it actually, that it can be enjoyed on many different levels according to the reader's own consciousness. So it can be read as a straight crime thriller, a murder mystery. If you want to get that out of it, then you could say that it's quite Agatha Christie-esque, I guess, or a bit like Inspector Morse, who's a famous, detective that was set in Oxford. All his stories were set in Oxford some decades ago. But then if you are someone who wants to delve a little bit deeper and scratch the surface and see what lies beneath, there are many other elements to it. There's a lot of coding that has taken place, particularly in the names of the characters. You get to learn a lot about the true nature and the true motives of the characters by studying their names. There's always a clue in what they've been called in the story. And then you've got some spiritual teachings. If you're open to them, then you'll find that there's a lot of knowledge that's being conveyed there, largely through the dialogue that certain characters speak. And then you've got certain allegorical, metaphorical aspects to it as well. So I'll let you jump in there with anything else you might want to ask.
Yeah. Oh, man. Yeah, like you said, it does have a lot of layers. And as you were talking, I'm thinking of some of these characters, especially one in particular. I don't know, are you prone to divulging spoilers on here? You prefer just to keep things kind of quiet for people just to find out on their own as they read the book? Because obviously one specific character just pops out, for me, and we know who that is with his dialogue and, very specific wording.
Are we talking the consciousness guru?
Yeah. And what's with that name? Do we want to drop that name? I know the first letter, it starts with an M in real life and with an M in the book.
No, we can drop the names. I'm happy to drop all the character names. What I don't want to do with these shows is obviously reveal how the story ends up. But we can talk about certain aspects, and we can talk about all the characters. So I think the character you're referring to is Max Zeal. And the reason I landed with that name is because some large parts of this story are based around experiences that I had back in 1990 and 91 when I worked in a radio newsroom. So, the story is set to a very large extent in the newsroom of a radio station which is known as Lux FM. So I'm having some fun with the name there. Lux as in light, as in the light bearer, as in Lucifer, possibly. So there's occult overtones there. In
that section of the book, that's towards the beginning, I think I picked up, did you insert a little cameo of yourself, this either intern or new radio station employee that was pale and thin? Was that you? The one who was taking care of the analog tapes and erasing them via that magnetic thing?
Yep. Well spotted, yeah. I've actually allowed myself a couple of Alfred Hitchcock-style cameos in the book. I mean, there's many cinematic elements to this. Maybe we could talk about this in a while, because another thing that inspired me to write this book is actually films. Ironically enough, I wrote a book inspired by my love of film, so we can get on to that. But yeah, I do appear a couple of times as a pale, skinny teenager, which I was at the time, doing skivvy tasks in the newsroom, because that's how I started out.
Just wanted to put that in there. I was like, hey, that's about that time in the book. I know you stood out for me there. I was like, I caught that.
Well, that's right. I did mention in the foreword to the book that there's a couple of cameos in there, so I've left it open to readers to spot where I crop up, and a couple of people have already identified that, so we've told everyone else now. But yeah, so that was me working in this radio newsroom back in 1990, and the name of the radio station was Fox FM. which doesn't exist anymore. It got taken over and absorbed into a different radio group. But back in the day, it was a very popular radio station in Oxford called Fox FM. Fox in gematria equates to 666, of course, rather interestingly. The name Max Seal, yeah. That came about because when I worked at Fox FM back in 1990, there was a DJ on the station whose real name was Mark Zeal. And he spelt it in the same way that the character does in the book. So it's Zeall. Real guy. He was a good friend of mine at the time. So then we've got this consciousness guru who spits a lot of the truth bombs in these lectures that he does. And also he puts out cassette tapes. This is another beautiful thing about the book, which I had an absolute blast writing about, was the technology of the time. Because in 1990, it was really the last days of analog. So it's before everything became digital and electronic. It's just before the internet first started to come in. It's just before everyone had a mobile phone. Mobile phones in 1990 were still fairly rare. The average person didn't own one. So there's a couple of references in the story, actually, to characters stopping at phone boxes in the street and fumbling around in their pockets for 50p coins to put in a phone box. Those of us of our generation can remember those days. It will seem outrageous to somebody, you know, a teenager in 2020, that 30 years ago you had to go and put a coin in a phone box in the street to make a call, but that's the way life was. And so it's kind of nostalgic, it's kind of an affectionate nod to what life was like back then. You've got cassettes, you've got reels of tape, you've got just analog phone calls taking place, faxes. Remember faxes? That preceded email. So you've got all this stuff going on. The journalists in the newsroom are all hammering away at typewriters. No computers back then, it's actual typewriters, and pulling out sheets of paper and reading sheets of paper on the radio airwaves. So yeah, it's a nod to all of those great times. Just going back to the name of Max Zeal, we've got this guy that is conveying a lot of this truthful information through the lectures and stuff that he does. And if people pay close attention to what Max Zeal conveys in this story, they will get a lot of wisdom and a lot of knowledge and a lot of very useful teachings. So in many ways, you could say that the main story or the main meaning that people are able to take away from The Cause and the Cure comes from the mouth of Max Zeal. In terms of other inspirations for that character, I don't know, man. I mean, what are you thinking?
Well, we spoke before, so I know who it is, but you were very obvious. Well, for people in the know.
Well, I think we'll just leave people. I think we'll leave people to figure it out.
Yes.
I will say that it's an amalgamation of three well-known characters. So
right, okay.
There's one character who's fairly dominant in terms of how they're represented by Max Zeal, but there's a couple of other names that people will be familiar with, so it's like an amalgamation of three names. But other than that, let's just leave it to people to figure out who it could be.
Right. Okay. All right. And then you kind of already touched on this regarding the 90s. Why the 90s? And I guess I'll connect this to the soundtrack that this book apparently comes with. And so before getting into the book, I listened to the soundtrack quite a few times. That's about a 2-hour audio file in today's terms that has a lot of music, news clips, and all kinds of stuff on there that it gets you in the mood, in the mindset of what the 1990 was like. And that, I think, was a brilliant, either marketing ploy or just another aspect of the book, getting people, or the reader or the listener, into that mindset, because that just fits so perfectly. When I started the book, there were already things in there that once you mention them in the book, for example, a particular singer that came out in the 90s, very talented young woman with an excellent voice and took everyone by storm. You have that, one of her songs, and even I think one of the radio pieces when they first introduced her on that audio clip, on that audio file. So that helped set the tone. How did you come up with that? Was that also something from the cinematic kind of part of you that, when you watch a movie, the music and soundtracks tend to keep that movie alive, in your mind and stuff. And then a set follow-up question to that is, how will the readers get access to that? Is there going to be like a CD or something that comes along with the book, or just some kind of a link to a digital online download, or what? So.
Sure. Well, that was the DJ in me coming through, wanting to put together that soundtrack. And I really enjoyed doing that as well, because 1990 was a great year for music when you listen back to some of those tunes. It opens with Sinead O'Connor, Nothing Compares to You. Then goes into Suzanne Vega, Tom's Diner, the DNA remix, and goes all the way through to a track from 1996, which represents the epilogue section of the book, which is a big rave dance tune from Westbam, and goes many places along the way. And as you say, I've spliced in little bits of news audio, and the singer that you mentioned there is Mariah Carey, who emerged onto the scene in 1990. I remember it well. And where you have that conversation set in the newsroom there, where Verity, the reporter, is chatting with one of the DJs, and he's saying, "Oh, listen to this," and he plays this cassette, and she's like, "Who's that? Whitney Houston?" Because everyone thought Mariah Carey sounded like Whitney Houston when she first came out. I remember all that. That's a real conversation that took place in the radio station, so I wanted to weave that in, just to give it some authenticity. The reason I decided on the soundtrack is going back to one of the inspirations for doing the book in the first place, which is my love of cinema. I feel that the storyline to the book is quite cinematic, and while I was writing it, I had all these scenes flashing through my mind. I was imagining how it would look if ever it were filmed and put out in the cinema. And I think it would make a great film if anyone ever committed it to film, I know it's never going to happen, but I can still carry that fantasy in my mind. So the idea behind the soundtrack was largely down to Quentin Tarantino and the great soundtracks that he puts out to all his films, starting with Pulp Fiction and going all the way through to the most recent Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Every time there's a Tarantino movie, it's got a great soundtrack to it, and it's a really imaginative selection of tunes that appear on there. And usually he splices in some dialogue from the film as well, so when you get the CD, you get little snippets from the film. So I thought it'd be great to do a version of that. And other elements of The Cause and the Cure that are cinematic would include the intermission. You might have noticed that round about midway through, there's a point where I go into a series of photographs. So I ran around Oxford last year taking pictures of a lot of the sites that figure in the story. These are real places, and if anyone ever wanted to come to Oxford and have a day out or make a weekend of it and go around all these places and take a look at them, I think it would make quite a fascinating thing to do, because they're all traceable, they're all trackable, they're all still there. So I've got this intermission, which is where the story pauses for a short while. You get a bunch of photos, and then the story picks up and continues on. And that was inspired by film as well. The likes of 2001: A Space Odyssey, for instance. On its original cinema release, there was an intermission. A break of about 15 minutes, I think it was. And I recently watched back the DVD to Dr. Zhivago, great movie from David Lean from 1965. That movie is like 3.5 hours long, and it came with an intermission to break it up. So I thought to myself, well, it'd be great to break up the story. And, I've taken people a certain way, and hopefully I've left them wanting more. They want to find out how this story ends, but I'll create a little bit of suspense and give them a bit of a breather before the story starts up again. So that was the idea behind that. And then we can look at some of the inspirations for aspects of the story. And I know you're a film lover yourself, Ivan, more of a film buff than me, actually. But there are a bunch of movies that inspired some of the scenes in the book, as well as a few UK TV shows. I'll just run through some of these quickly because you might recognise some of the elements that I included there. So obviously there's Inspector Morse, the detective based in Oxford, created by Colin Dexter. People are going to draw comparisons between my story and the Inspector Morse stories, mainly because of the Oxford setting. That's inevitable. Then there were a couple of great UK TV shows or TV series in recent years. I don't really watch TV, but I did make a point of watching these shows because they really were great. They really stood out head and shoulders above anything else on TV. One was a trilogy called Red Riding, which came out about 10 years ago, based on a series of books by David Peace. And they were set in West Yorkshire, Leeds and surrounds in the 1970s going into the 80s. And it really showed the sleazy, seedy, harsh side of that city and police corruption and just low life. It was a real antithesis to Inspector Morse. And so I've included some elements of that in the book, particularly the police corruption, the fact that none of the cops are particularly virtuous, with the exception of May Pierce, who is one of the central characters, the young woman constable. Then there was a great show a few years ago, or two shows actually. The original one was called Life on Mars, and then there was a sequel called Ashes to Ashes, obviously based around David Bowie song titles. So this had a period setting. Those shows were set in the 70s and the 80s, as mine is set in the early 90s. And there were plenty of cultural references in those shows to the music and the lifestyle of the times. So that inspired me to want to really bring 1990 and 91 back to life through this story. Another thing about those shows is that everyone smokes in the workplace. You never see anyone without a cigarette in their hand. And that's also something you get in The Cause and the Cure, because I remember well working in the radio station back in 1990. Everyone was smoking because it was just the done thing back then. There was also a comedy TV show many years ago called Drop the Dead Donkey, which showed the sort of comical side of working in a TV newsroom. And actually the radio newsroom of Fox was very similar to what was portrayed in Drop the Dead Donkey. There's also The Office, the TV show. I know there's been an American version of that, which as far as I can make out is bloody awful and about as funny as cancer. But the original British version with Ricky Gervais was absolutely inspiring. And it really summed up the humdrum drudgery of daily life in the workplace. So there's aspects of that in the story as well. But let's get into some movies. Magnolia. Are you familiar with the Paul Thomas Anderson movie, Magnolia?
Yes, it's been quite a few years. I know which one you're talking about. Tom Cruise, I believe, was in that.
Sure. Yeah, Tom Cruise plays a kind of guru, a kind of motivational speaker. And he's delivering these seminars, and he gets very hyped up during these seminars. And so there's overtones of that in Max Zeal's seminars and how he gets very impassioned in his delivery. So, I partly got the idea of that from that aspect of Magnolia. The Shawshank Redemption, we don't want to give too much about the book plot away here, but obviously at the end of that movie there's the desperate escape through the tunnel when Tim Robbins' character finally makes it out of jail, and in the book there's an escape through a tunnel as well. So there's that. Now we have the perpetrator. Not going to say this individual's name, but towards the end of the book we get to find out who's been committing all these dastardly murders. And there's a section where this individual gets chased through the streets of Oxford. This was partly inspired by two classic car chases in the world of movies, in Bullitt and The French Connection. So Steve McQueen in Bullitt in 1968, Gene Hackman in The French Connection 1971. The most amazing car chases in cinema history. And initially I thought, wouldn't it be great to have a car chase through the city of Oxford? And then I thought, well, maybe that's a bit cliched because car chases have been done to death in movies. But what about a chase on foot? What about this person just getting pursued through the streets of Oxford and all he's got to rely on is running? So we get that. And, there's a certain section of the city. I actually paced it myself. I went to the part of the city where that aspect of the story is set and walked around and thought, now where would this person run and where would they hide and where would they escape to? So I've built all the place names into that aspect, and so we have a hopefully exciting chase on foot instead of by car. Then we have Human Traffic, which was a movie that came out at the end of the 90s, and it documented the clubbing dance music scene of the time. And obviously we've got that subplot running through The Cause and the Cure, where it just keeps popping up references to this rave scene, and it's kind of woven into other aspects of the plot. Then you may have noticed that when the individual that I've just mentioned is getting chased through the streets of Oxford, I've sort of juxtaposed that with what's happening down at the police station. So I won't go into the detail, but what you get is a scene where a couple of individuals are arrested, I'll just say that, and then you get scenes, set at the police station in the cell block, and then you get a scene where this individual is getting chased and pursued through the streets of Oxford, and then it cuts back to the police station scenario, and then it cuts back to the chase through the streets. What inspired that was the wrapping up part of The Godfather Part 2, and I think it may have been in Part 1 as well, which is where, towards the end of the movie, you're finding out what happens to all the characters, and the pace really picks up, and there's these rapid cuts from scene to scene, where
it's like a cleaning house.
What's that?
It's like a cleaning house. You notice everything's being taken care of all at once.
Exactly. Everything's being wrapped up. So you're like, oh, okay, that's what happened to that character, and here's what's happening to this guy. And so I wanted to cross between scenes to progress each part of the story, but to insert the other aspect as well. So both stories are being developed in tandem with each other in sequence. You know what I mean?
Right.
Then I've nearly finished with these inspirations. Another one would be Rosemary's Baby.
Uh-huh.
And in that movie, which is one of my all-time favourites, everyone around Rosemary, the central character, turns out to be a member of the cult, the Satanic Secret Society. And in this book, there are similarities to it because many of the characters that you come to meet also turn out to be a part of a secret society fraternity. And you really wonder who can be trusted. Then you have a couple of characters, one from Pulp Fiction, Tarantino's movie, the Harvey Keitel character, Winston Wolfe. So he's called in towards the end of the movie to clean up a situation that John Travolta and Samuel L. Jackson have got themselves into. He's the guy that you call on to fix everything and, clean it up. And you might remember, I'm sure you've seen Things to Do in Denver When You're Dead.
Yes.
You have Steve Buscemi's character there, who is, I forget his name. He's got a name. He's like the something. Can you remember his name?
No, not off the top of my head, not right now. I haven't seen that one in a long time.
Right. Well, he also is a guy that this crime mob calls in to mop everything up, to clean everything up, to take care of business.
Usually what they're called are the cleaners, like the cleaner.
I think he is called the cleaner, yeah. I think that's his name in the film. And so I've got the fixer. I've got an individual that I've dubbed the fixer, and he's someone that is called on to take care of a situation. So he was inspired by them. And then finally, you've got, in my book, the perpetrator, the individual that's carrying out these murders. And this person was partly inspired by the Assassin, as he was known, in Angels and Demons by Dan Brown. And you had the film version with Tom Hanks. He's the guy that's going around doing all the killings. So as you can see, it was a big melting pot of cultural references and inspirations there. It's TV shows and movies that I've absorbed through the years that have kind of stayed in my psyche, combined with my personal experiences working in a radio station, combined with nostalgic affection for the 90s, because I bloody loved the 90s, man. I had an absolute ball in the 90s, because I didn't know any of this stuff. I didn't know all the stuff that I know now. I didn't realise the world is run by, this psychopathic cabal that is hell-bent on enslaving and subjugating humanity. I just thought life was all about partying and having fun and, having a good time. And I love the 90s. So I think that comes through.
Yeah, I think, you were a good slave, I guess, in the 90s, huh? Too bad you had to wake up and...
I know, man. Waking up is a bitch.
Yes, it is. Yes. Now, you know what? I guess we could be kind of close to the end here. You talked quite a bit about the book, but there's one little aspect that I think we need to bring up intentionally, and that's all the occulted information in there. You've touched a little bit on that and everything you've said so far. However, specifically, there's just people who are in the know, just being an initiate. And the intention with this book, making people who already know aspects of the occult, they'll tick these things off. Example, Hermetic principles, that you drop that word in there, the Kabbalion, all that, part aspects of natural law, non-aggression principle, all this stuff. Was that also part of the intention of this book, to put an aspect that will resonate with the quote-unquote truther community, the awakened community, and also plant seeds to people who might just come at the book, like you said, for the whodunit aspect, the mystery thing? Because I noticed there was, like I said, beginning to end, there were specific things said by specific people, their names dropped stuff in there, and then knowing what we know, there were actual verbatim words and sentences that was like, hey, that's literally what this person would have said, different name in the book, but, so touch on that real quick to wrap it up, as far as the occulted knowledge, the truth, and all, the main, what I consider the main heart of what this book's trying to convey, the things that people don't know and should know.
Well, yes, pretty much as you said there. I've tried to present the truthful information aspects and the knowledge and the teachings aspects of the narrative in a way that is going to wake up somebody that has never looked at this type of information before. So if somebody picks up this book thinking, it's set in Oxford in 1990, I know Oxford, I remember 1990, I used to go raving then, this looks like an interesting book, and it's a murder mystery as well, it's probably like Inspector Morse. If they're expecting to get that out of it, then hopefully they will, but they're going to get a whole lot more besides. They're going to get all this incredible knowledge dropped on them, and they're not going to have been expecting it. So as long as they don't chalk it all up as fiction, and when they hear Max Aziel going off at his seminars with all this information, and you hear Keith and Phil and Verity talking about all this stuff, as long as people don't write that off as a fictional aspect of the novel, and as long as they realise that there is actually some potency and validity to what's being said there, they're going to get a whole lot out of it. But also, there are many nods to what we would term truth seekers, people in these times that have come to a comprehension of the way the world really is and who's really running things and what all these agendas are ultimately aimed at achieving. The book is kind of ahead of its time there. So in 1990, you've got Keith and Phil, these two friends. Keith is Verity's boyfriend, Phil is his best mate from college, and they're having these conversations, whereas, they're guys in their early 20s. And whereas most guys in their early 20s in 1990 would have been going clubbing or going down the pub or playing football, these two guys are having amazing conversations about occult knowledge and spiritual teachings and all this stuff. And we find Keith reading books by the likes of Jim Mars and James Billington, Fire in the Minds of Men. And he's got a cassette of May Brussel that's just arrived in the mail. So, this is a young guy that is taking personal responsibility towards truth. And he's having all these great conversations and taking on all this knowledge. So he's kind of an embodiment of what many people in these times are now coming to a realization of. And of course, we've got the benefit, and have had the benefit, of being able to do this via the internet. That's made it very easy to research all these things. Certainly, this book would never have been written if I'd not had access to the internet. I'd probably still be out there DJing in clubs and none the wiser to any of this stuff. So the internet has so much to answer for in that regard. But in 1990, it was a case of getting books, listening to cassettes, attending lectures, and that was the only way to get this information. So I'm trying to get both kind of communities on board with this book. The regular mainstream, what people would refer to as normies, and then the truth seekers. So through the two main female characters, you've got a couple of individuals that are on a journey towards truth seeking. They're on a personal journey of discovery and maturing and development and spiritual growth. So you've got Verity, Hunter. As I say, all the names are coded. Verity comes from the French word verité, which means truth, and that's derived from the Latin veritas. And then, of course, Hunter. A hunter is someone who is seeking something. So Verity Hunter, the radio reporter, who is the central character of the story, her name literally means truth seeker. And so she's a representation of somebody that is going through this process of awakening. And she didn't set out consciously to undergo this at the start of the story. She just kind of got plunged into it. And by the time she gets to the end of the story, she's completely different. She's changed. Life is never going to be the same again for her. And then her experience is contrasted with that of WDC May Pierce, who's a woman police constable. She's in her 20s as well. Had a bit of fun with her because I thought, if I'm going to have female characters and, they're young, they might as well be hot. Might as well make them hotties, So the thing about May Pierce is wherever she goes, all the male characters are kind of drooling with their tongues hanging on the floor at her because, she's hot. She's getting wolf whistles and everyone's trying to get with her, So I just had some fun with that. And I decided that I wanted to have a female character. I always had in mind that it would be Verity. And then I decided to add May Pierce as well. So there's another piece of wordplay. May, as in there's a possibility. It may happen, it may not. And Pierce, as in piercing the veil of illusion and seeing through to what lies on the other side. So it's another reference to the truth-seeking process and the awakening process. So this character may pierce that illusion, or she may not. So will she? Read the story and find out. So we've got these two female characters, and I thought to myself, it would be so easy, or it would have been so easy for me to have a central male character, a young male, based on my own memories of those times. And I thought, no, I don't want to make it that easy on myself. I want to set myself the challenge of considering what life would be like for a young female, and not only that, but a young black female. So I'm a middle-aged white guy, and I've tried to put myself into the mind of a young black female in 1990. And I thought, I just want to challenge myself to consider the way she would see the world, and to put a bit of detail in there about what her life is like and what her preferences are like and all this sort of thing. So that's why I settled on these two female characters. Of course, there are male characters in there. Most of the characters are male. But the two central ones are Verity and May. And they're both going through this process of self-discovery and awakening at the same time. They both kind of get embroiled in it unwittingly. And we find out, what happens to each of them and what sort of people they are at the end of it. Largely through the epilogue set in 1996. So yeah, that's why I did all that, man.
Wow. Yeah, I thought I noticed some stuff from the beginning of the book. I think it's one of the characters, one of the females, has a brother, and there's a point. I guess he's one of the DJs or something, and he's talking with
Drew, yeah.
kind of accent man and all this kind of thing, and then they drop it to get back into their British accent thing. I'm like, hey, okay. So I picked that up. It was like, that's interesting. Okay, that would play with that. But yeah, what you were talking about also with the internet in the epilogue, you kind of give a nod to that in a positive way of the potentiality way back in 96 of how one character's observation of what can possibly happen with the internet giving them hope. So that was good. And you're evidence of that right here, in 2020 now, that, the last decade or so, the internet has been very crucial as far as how far we've come or how much others have been held back. But it still, remains to be seen which direction we're going to actually go. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff in this book that, I think this is a book, one read is not enough. You have to go through and read it or listen to it or read it and listen to it several times to pick up, like any good film does. The first time you watch a movie, it hooks you and you take something away. But the second time you go back and watch it, you find things you didn't notice the first time. And then the third time, you find something else. And I think this book has the potential to have all that in there, that the first time you read it or hear it, you pick up on something, and that's still bouncing around in your head as you're reading, and you're missing other stuff. And then the second time you go back, you pick up on what you already know, and then you pick up something else, and it goes deeper and deeper. So, yeah, good kudos to you. And hey, well done, because there's not too many of us out there doing what you're doing. And like you said, the end of last year, you've been pretty busy, and I can see it. I see all the constant posts online. You're still putting out shows. You're putting out, writing a book, doing all this stuff, still interviewing people. So yeah, you're still going. You're busy. You're truly doing the great work, and I wish you all the best with this book. So yeah.
Well, thank you, sir. I mean, one of the reasons I have been so productive in recent times is because I knew this move was coming up, and I'm going to be relocating, and it's going to take a hell of a lot of time just doing physical stuff, moving shit, So I've just tried to get as much stuff as I can out before that process kicks in, and just put it out there in the world and leave people with it. And this book was part of that. Just picking up on a few things that you mentioned there, the character Drew, who is Verity's cousin, so Drew Hunter, and had some fun with his name because he's a habitual weed smoker. He states that he gets knowledge from the universe through smoking marijuana. So I've called him Drew, as in like he drew on the spliff. He kind of drew the knowledge in, from the ether. So that's how his name came about. And we've got this amusing situation where when the two of them see each other, initially they greet each other in Jamaican patois, in West Indian street slang. And it's very interesting because they're not actually Jamaican. Their families are Bajan. They're from Barbados, but they crack all these Jamaican slang words on each other. And then once they've got the initial greetings out of the way, they lapse back into their regular, English dialects, their natural-born accents. And this is real-life situations as well, because back in the day, I used to have a lot of black friends due to the circles that I moved in, and I knew a lot of their families, and I would go to their homes, and they really would do this. They would greet each other with patois, and then they'd go back into their English, accents. So I thought it'd be amusing to get that in there.
And the epilogue, the internet being...
Oh, yeah. There's lots of references to the future in 1990. So, first of all, you've got the smoking that takes place in the workplace. And you've got the sports editor, Mateo, who may or may not be based on a real person from back in the day. So he's always got his feet up on the desk, and he's always, sleeping under the racing pages of the Sun newspaper and all this. But he's always got a Benson and Hedges blazing. He's always got a fag on the go, And Verity teases him at one point in the story and says, "Oh, you're not going to be able to smoke forever, in the office when a smoking ban comes in." And Mateo says, "Oh, it will never happen. Dream on. There's no way that's ever going to happen." And of course it did. So it's a little throw forward to the future there. And then there's a news headline that comes in. Some of the reporters are looking at the stories of the day, and there's a story about Tim Berners-Lee, who is the guy that is credited with having invented the World Wide Web. I suspect otherwise, but he's the guy that gets the credit for it anyway. And they're saying, "Oh, this is going to change the world when this World Wide Web comes in." And one of the characters says, "It will never take off, no chance." And of course, here we are, knowing a lot better. And then in 1996, in the epilogue, you've got Max Zeal and Keith, who's now working alongside him, and they're very excited about the prospects that await humanity of the unleashing of the internet and the incredible ability this is going to have to share information that was never previously accessible to large numbers of people. And that's what we're witnessing today. There's good points and bad points about the internet. Obviously, it has its shady kind of nefarious aspects, but it also has incredibly positive benefits as well. So there's a reference to that. And then when you were talking about people really could get a lot out of reading the book 2 or 3 times. Don't just read it once and put it back in the bookcase, but read it once and maybe come back to it a month later and go through it again, because you are going to spot things that you missed the first time around. And that has been inspired largely by the most incredible filmmaker of them all, the genius himself, the masterpieces of Stanley Kubrick. You can watch a Kubrick movie not just 2 or 3 times, but 6, 8, 10 times, and still find layers that you hadn't noticed before. Or you can watch a video of some analyst on YouTube that's taken apart these films frame by frame and saying, look what he's placed in the background here, and look at the symbolism of that, and look at the lighting and what that tells us. And you think, my God, how many layers did this guy encode into his scenes, and how long must it have taken to storyboard this and work out how to get all these elements in there. And that has been hugely inspirational to me. And I thought to myself, well, if I can achieve even a fraction of what Kubrick did in his movies by getting all this stuff into the book, that will be an incredible process. So I've attempted to do that, and that's why I feel that if people do give it 2 or 3 reads, they are going to be rewarded at certain points by saying, wow, I never noticed that last time round. Yeah, I see what that name means now. And, oh, I see why that character said that line of dialogue now, knowing what I do about them. So that was always an intentional thing.
Yeah, that leaves me kind of numb. I'm like, wow, yeah, I need to go back and redo this book again. So,
did you have any favorite characters, may I ask you?
Well, my personal bias is with, Max Zeal, because, I know right off the bat, I was like, okay, I know who that is. And,
well, the other thing about the name, because all the names are coded, remember? So it's Max Zeal. So zeal means passion, burning with passion and enthusiasm for something. And then Max obviously is derived from maximum, to the max. So it's like impassioned delivery to the max through this person.
So if people want to get their hands on this book that we're talking about all this time, like, what the heck is this book? I mean, where can we get it? What's going on here? So give us the scoop on this. Digital, physical book, audio, when, where, what's the detail?
Okay, so the book is available in paperback form. You can get it on Amazon. If you just search for The Cause and the Cure, Mark Devlin on Amazon, you'll find it there. It's also on Barnes & Noble. But if anyone wants to get a copy from me personally, which I can sign, and I can mail that out anywhere in the world, just drop me an email to markdevlinuk@gmail.com, and we can arrange that. Usually best if you pay by PayPal, but there's other methods as well, and then I can post the book out to you. There's a Kindle version, so for people that like to get their books that way, you can grab the Kindle version. I'm working on an audio version at the moment. I've just started voicing that. I've got a female friend of mine that is voicing the female parts, so it's going to probably sound something like a radio play, which is the closest I'm ever going to get to this book being made into a movie. I'm under no illusion that that's never going to happen, so a radio play is probably the closest we'll ever get. And then the soundtrack, which you mentioned earlier, there's a 2-hour soundtrack of music and audio snippets from the times, authentic, original 1990 and 91 material. That's available as a download. So it's on my Spreaker page. I'll put the link to it in the show notes below this, but if anyone wants to go to Spreaker.com and just put in Mark Devlin, The Cause and the Cure soundtrack, you'll find it there. That's a free download. I would have put it on YouTube, but we all know that if I had, it would have been shut down the minute I uploaded it on copyright grounds, because you can't upload music there. So I've just put it on Spreaker, and you can stream it or download it from there. So, yeah, that's it, man.
All right, excellent. Okay. So I guess that wraps up episode 150 of Good Vibrations. Once again, it's been an honor and a pleasure to host your excellent show. 150 episodes. Man, Mark, you're busy. You're busy, man. And 3 books. Whew.
Yeah, well, it's got to be done. It's got to be done. So, yeah, we should probably do this in about another 2 years. I can't promise that I'll have my next book written by then, but it has become something of a tradition. And while you're on, let me ask you, man, I mean, what are you up to? You had your Guy Next Door podcast. Are you taking a bit of a hiatus from that, or is that coming back anytime soon?
Who knows? Who knows? Hiatus is the proper word. Yeah. The way things are in the world, I mean, yeah, even some of our someone like Mark Passio with What on Earth is Happening, he's taking a hiatus too. Not that I'm comparing myself to him or anything, but the state of the world, you look around, and yeah, a lot of work needs to be done, and it's just, yeah, too few of us doing it. But I'm just...
Yeah, you can't burn yourself out. You're no good to anyone if you get down and despondent and emotionally and physically exhausted. You've got to take a bit of time out sometimes and, repair yourself so you can continue to do the work for others.
Exactly. And even without intentionally wanting to be out there on my own putting out stuff, I mean, look, I'm helping you out hosting your show, so this is a little bit of work that I'm helping with here.
Sure.
Not too long ago, we did a show with our friend Francesco out of Italy with his podcast, that Anarchy Roundtable. So yeah, little by little, even without intentionally going out and quote unquote busting, I have to do stuff. There's little things that each of us can do here and there, helping each other out and to contribute and put some content out there. So yeah, I'm again, thanks for asking me to host your show, and yeah, hopefully we'll do this again soon.
All right, no worries. Thanks for coming on, Ivan.
Well, thank you for coming on your own show.
On my own show, yeah.
Appreciate
you having me.
All right, I'll return the reins to you for your next episode. So I'll go ahead and end this the way I usually do my podcast. Thanks for listening. Whenever you're listening to this, good morning, good afternoon, or good night, and be well.
This is just a wrap.
I'm picking up vibrations. I'm picking up vibrations. I'm picking up